Good afternoon, it's Nicholas from Gandora Gaming, and I want to do something different on my channel. Today I wanted to discuss the most complicated decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm a big fan of Yu-Gi-Oh! I have 250 decks, and I've played a lot of it. I play a lot of decks I don't own, and I play a lot of decks I do own. And I figured, why not for my first ever series of, videos, besides just deck profiles and my usual content, I would do videos tackling complicated subjects or just concepts in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I feel like one of them is, why do people have trouble getting into Yu-Gi-Oh! Unlike other card games? Well, that's because unlike other card games, there's a lot of really complicated mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! And there's a lot of complicated decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! So I figured, why not just go over the most complicated decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! It'll be a lot of fun, and I'd love to see the comments below. I did a poll on my community tab about this, and you guys were really excited about it. You voted a lot, so here's the video. I hope you all enjoy, and let's just go straight into this. So, first things first, honorable mentions. I only have, I guess it's our 11 most complicated deck. This is an honorable mention. This is Sharks. Sharks or rank 4 spam. This deck is really, really cool. It's kind of complicated in the way you don't expect decks to be complicated. It's complicated in the fact that it allows you... There's so many locks in the deck. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to most rank 4 spam decks, you're just summoning out a whole bunch of level 4s and making XYZs, and then that's about it. And that ain't too complicated. But when it comes to rank 4 Sharks, I believe they have 3 to 4 different kinds of locks in the deck itself. And what I mean by a lock, I mean like there's in-archetype cards that lock you out of certain things you can do for the rest of the turn. For example, there is a water lock, there's an XYZ lock, there is a hand lock, and I believe in some cards, in some variants of decks, there's also a fish lock. And I think I already said XYZ lock. There's just a whole bunch of locks in Sharks, which is surprising, because when you see the deck go off, it's just like, okay, summon a level 4, summon out another level 4, another level 4, make an XYZ, make another level 4, another level 4, etc., etc. But when you actually start reading the cards and you realize you gotta do these cards in certain orders, because if you try to go for Utopia Draco play, but you already locked yourselves into water, well then shit, you can't do that. And another example of this is like, okay, you activated Silent Angler in hand. Oh wait, Silent Angler says once you spend something once, you can't spend something for the rest of the turn from your hand. That turns off your entire hand. Oh shit. Some decks play the Tangy monster, the normal monster. That requires you to have a normal monster on field or no monsters on field. It's just like really weird scenarios like that. And a deck can make you easily, allure you with how simplistic it is. And then, once you realize the restrictions, or at least when your opponent realizes the restrictions and points them out to you, it's going to be a headache. This deck doesn't take too hard to learn. You just need to know which cards restrict you where, and when best to use these cards. That's honestly the most complicated part about Sharks, but other than that, deck's pretty simple. It is rank 4 spam to begin with. Not really doing any modulating levels. But I guess there is a little bit of modulating levels, because there's also a number lock. I forgot to mention that. So, one of the number monsters, or I guess they're not really number monsters, but they're just Sharks in general, require you to have to make number monsters. You can't just use them for generic level 4, level 5 cards. Like, to treat them as level 4s, you have to use them for number XYZs, which is important. So, honestly, this deck is really, really cool, and when people are really, really good at it, it's very simple. But when you're first time getting into Yu-Gi-Oh! And someone says, hey, pick up Sharks, and you start playing it out and realize, well, you're misplaying because you're not reading the cards right, and you're not realizing what restricts what. So that is it for my honorable mention. Let's just go straight into number 10, because I have them both tied. So for number 10, I have Sky Striker and Spellbook. Now, these decks are both complicated in another way. So they're both resource management decks. I think every deck that's complicated is a resource management combo wombo deck. Well, these are only 2 control decks on this list. Control decks usually aren't that complicated. They're usually just Ooga Booga Stun. But because Spellbooks and Sky Striker are both just spell control decks, they play differently. You have to manage your resources very importantly when it comes to control decks, which is why not every control deck is just Ooga Booga. Now, when you play Floodgates or Mystic Mind and things like that, you are kind of Ooga Booga, but at the same time, you're not. It's complicated. There's tug and pull. There's moments when you're Ooga Booga, and there's moments when you have to know how many spells you've used, which ones have you used, how to get those resources back into a loop. A lot of resource loops that out advantage your opponent, which is very important in control decks, because if they can't out resource you, well, they're not outpowering you, and they're definitely not making a board that you can't beat. So they have to out-resource and out-control you out of the game. So that's why I put Spellbooks and Sky Strikers here. I think Spellbooks are a little bit more harder, because there's a whole banish mechanic to them, when you can banish your Spellbooks and then return them back to the deck and organize your deck in different orders. But I felt like Sky Striker is just the modern-day version of Spellbook. So I put them both on this list because you definitely know the difference between a skilled Sky Striker player and a normal Sky Striker player. The normal one plays the deck and just relies on mine, and a skilled Sky Striker player plays the deck. You know what I mean when you deal with them? There's a difference, and you definitely need to learn these decks to their fullest potential, every minute detail. And I know it's with every deck, to be honest, but especially with these two. Alright, so now it's time to go on to number 9. Alright, so for number 9, we have Ritual Beast. Now, Ritual Beast is one of the OG complicated decks. This deck needs a lot of support, and honestly, it was definitely complicated for its time, but I think as Yu-Gi-Oh! Has advanced since then, I feel like this deck is no longer as complicated as people believe, or at least it's as complicated as it's ever been, but more stuff has made more complicated in this deck, if that makes sense. So Ritual Beast, if you don't know, is an archetype between two different types. There's the Psychics, which are the Ritual Beast Tamers, and then there's the Beast Monsters. Well, not all of them are beasts. There's I think there's an Aqua, and they're all different types. And basically they're the Beast Monsters. They're the Ritual Beast. And the whole archetype is a contact fuse archetype that revolves around looping your fusion monsters with your tamers. So all the fusion monsters require a tamer and a Ritual Beast monster to fuse into, well, in this case, Ulti Kinahawk, who's not on once return. So because of Ulti Kinahawk is not on once return, you can loop him multiple times a turn, but he requires different names to be used every time. And what I mean by that is, when you make Ritual Beast Kinahawk, you can't use the same two names in the fusion. So if you use Tamer and, let's say, Rampengu, you can't use Rampengu and Tamer again. You have to use something else. You have to use a different Ritual Beast monster in that scenario. It's just a whole bunch of looping and knowing your names. And not to mention, this deck lives and dies in the Banish Zone, which is another complication, because a lot of decks don't really mess with the Banish Zone. Most decks, if they go in the Banish Zone, they're not using them anymore. They're gone. They're a lost resource. But when it comes to Ritual Beast, it's the opposite. They lose their resources in Grave. Don't get me wrong, they can still get them back from Grave, but it's harder for them. They live and die in the Banish Zone. So it's very, very important for them to, do their thing. Next deck we have for, I guess, number 8, we have Synchrons. Now, Synchrons is another really, really cool, fascinating deck. This deck is our modern-day Wombo combo deck. Synchro Summon. Well, first, I guess, just Synchro Summon to your heart's content. It's nothing really too special. You gotta know your levels and your placements in zones. That's probably the most complicated thing when it comes to Synchrons. Because Synchrons are complicated in the fact that there is a shit ton of different levels and different types, and some are tuners and some are non-tuners, and some monsters become tuners, and some reborn from grave, and some miss timing. There's a lot of things you gotta keep track as a Synchron player. This is probably one of the most complicated combo decks in the game, and I'm glad to say that Synchrons are just pretty strong in general. I never thought I'd say that. When Synchrons were, back in, 2011 age, like, yeah, you had like Dandelion format and stuff like that, but like, besides like as an archetype, I'm actually quite surprised Jet Synchron and all of them are just so good right now. Now, don't get me wrong, they're still rogue, but that's just because the deck is so hard to pilot. The deck is complicated, it's unforgiving, it's resource management, because you gotta resource into your monsters. Because you run out of resources, you're not gonna be able to build your board, and you just have to know your levels, and you have to know your tuners and what does what and what interacts with what. For example, Doppel Warrior, one of the best cards in the deck, misses timing because he's a win effect depending on when you use him. Very important. So you just gotta know the little interactions when it comes to Synchrons. I think you'll be on your way. So now it's time to go on to number 7. Alright, so for number 7, I felt like we had to put our first Pendulum deck in Demeons. Now, Demeons are probably one of the more complicated Pendulum decks, just for the simple fact they are pendulums, which is probably the most complicated mechanic in all Yu-Gi-Oh! As you know, pendulums require scales, and your scales have there's 2 effects on every pendulum. So there's always the pendulum effect, the monster effect, and of course there's the scales you need to balance, and you need to be able to pendulum summon into your zones. There's a lot of complications when it comes to Endymions, but what makes Endymions stand out as probably one of the most complicated decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that not only are they a pendulum mechanic, but they're a spell counter mechanic. Books kind of dealt with spell counters, but this deck really plays with spell counters to a whole new level. And this deck does everything that spellbooks do, but even more so because it's a pendulum deck. Because you gotta be balanced. Not only you gotta have a dice for this deck, just because for the simple fact you're gonna be using dice to put spell counters on your cards. It's ridiculous how many spellback counters you get on this deck, and you gotta know the resources and the pendulum scales and how you're gonna pendulum summon out monsters. This deck is all in all just very, very complicated because a lot of their monsters require you to have a shit ton of counters on them. So if you can't accrue the counters and you are not making optical boards, you're just mucking up. So this deck is definitely very, very complicated, and I would say it's probably the second most complicated pendulum deck we have in Yu-Gi-Oh! To this day. I think a third place, which is an honorable mention I wanted to include, was Valiance. And the reason why I include Valiance is because they're a really, really new archetype that just came out. But the thing with Valiance that why I don't think they belong on this list is, one, they're new. Of course, they're going to be complicated because no one knows what they do yet. But at the same time, they don't play like every other pendulum deck. They special summon themselves from these scales. Kind of like Abyss Actors do. For example, they're kind of like all the entire archetype is Current Riser. If that makes any sense to anybody. So the deck's complicated in the fact that it doesn't play like pendulum decks. But because of that, it's kind of even more simplified. And yes, they do move around the field, and that's complicated itself. So I probably should have put them on this list. But I would say Endymions are definitely number 8. And if you wanted to, you could probably squeeze a Valiance right here as well. Because Valiants are just as complicated. And yeah, let's just go straight on to number 6. Alright, so for number 6, we have Tier Elements. Now, Tier Elements is a holy shit complicated deck. In like all the weird ways. So for first things first, when I say Tier Elements, I say Tier Elements as Yugioh. It's Yugioh Tier Element, and it's complicated in a weird way. It's probably one of the most complicated decks we got in the newest, like, new age of 2022. Just for the simple fact of chain links. This deck is so cracked that you're going to be milling 10, your opponent's going to be milling 10, and it's not uncommon to do a shit ton of chain links a turn. Just for example, I went into my regional playing a Yugioh Tier Elements versus pure Tier Elements, and we got up to chain link 10, and then we resolved 5 other chain links afterwards. So after chain link 10 resolved, we undid another chain link 5 or 6, and then after that we did another chain link 5 or 6. So this deck is just a shit ton of chain links because you're milling so many cards and activating so many effects in graveyard. I don't think the building the board part is hard. Like, solitarying this deck is probably not the hardest thing in the world. But when you're playing against people, especially the mirror match, This deck gets 10 times more complicated because not only are you managing your effects, you're managing your chain links, and you're managing your summons. Because you gotta know which tier element you use. You gotta know which cards you got sent to the graveyard. Which ones have effects. Which ones your opponent has to deal with. If they're playing the mirror, which ones are they interacting with? Tier elements is very underrated. I think on my poll, I think they were like one of the lowest listing ones when I said complicated decks, which I think is kind of surprising. I feel like this is because a lot of people don't play tier element, and because they just see the deck wombo combo and they're just like, well, I just lose, so they don't get a chance to interact with it. But when you do interact with this deck, holy shit, the chain links are insane. Like, you can go through one whole turn in like 10 to 15 minutes for that one turn just because you're resolving chain links. It is ridiculously complicated. And that's why I have tier elements as number 6. Not to mention another reason why I put tier elements here. There's a lot of shit. There's a lot of a shit ton of ways to play tier elements. There's branded tier elements, Splice tier elements, Asiju tier elements, Paleo tier elements. There's like 20 different tier element decks, and there's so many different cards, interactions you can play with this deck that it just makes it really, really complicated, especially when managing your chain link. So that's why I have tier elements here. Time to go into the number 5, the big boys now, and this shit gets intense from here. Alright, so for number 5, we have Code Talkers, Lynx, Mathmech. Basically the deck profile I posted 2 days ago, and I keep posting deck profiles on. That's probably one of the most complicated decks I've ever played. Cybers in general, and Code Talkers, and just all this mechanics are probably one of the more complicated mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! Which is surprising because you would think that, you know, they're not too complicated. It's Lynx. They're like probably the most simplest made monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! They just require just effect monsters most of the time. And you are correct on that. They only require effect monsters. That's why they're number 5. Because they're very easy to make. What makes it complicated is the fact that not only your Cybers locked, so 1, you have to play in the archetype, but 2 is that you have to manage not only your resources, but also your placement. Probably more than any other deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! When you make links, you gotta know which zones you're putting those links in to plan out for later zones. Because like I said, this deck, as I've shown in yesterday's or the day after that video, this deck can combo for days. Like literally, I'm going through my entire extra deck in like one turn. That's how much resources you can put into this deck. And you just filter them throughout. And what makes it so complicated is knowing zone placement. Knowing what links need to co-link to what links. Where you're going to make this monster to that monster. How link 3s, if they're going to link 2s, how links are treated when link summoning. Things of that nature. It's a whole bunch of like mechanics you're not usually used to. Because when people play links, they use them like, you make an Appaloosa. That's it. That's your only link you really make. Or you make an IP Masquerada. They don't really make 5 or 6 links. And when you get into that many links, you gotta realize links and pendulums are probably the two most mechanically challenged decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! It probably goes pendulums 1, links 2. And the reason why I can say that is because link summoning requires you to have your zones open and also your resources managed, because you gotta use a whole bunch of monsters to make those links. But you also have your arrows pointing correctly. If you make a monster and its arrows pointing the wrong way, well, then you can stop your entire strategy. Or if you have a monster blocking the zone that you need to make another monster in, you can be stopped in your tracks so freaking easily, it's ridiculous. So that's why I have Code Talkers, or Mathmech, or Geomathmech, or just Cybers in general here at number 5. And everything from here is pretty insane, not gonna lie. They're just like the most complicated decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! I didn't think Code Talkers were gonna be hard, but honestly, I think I had more trouble learning Code Talkers than our number 4 placement. But I felt like I had to put number 4 where he is, because number 4 is so infamous for being complicated But if I didn't, I have riots in the streets in my comments. Because number 4 is DDD. Yes, DDD. Everyone's like poster boy when it comes to most complicated decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, look at the spreadsheets. I mean, this deck says it all. It's complicated, I'm not gonna lie. It makes every summoning mechanic in the game except, I think, rituals. It's the only mechanic it doesn't make. It makes fusion, synchro, XYZ, link, pendulum. It does everything over the moon. The only thing it doesn't do is ritual, which is fine. And honestly, that's probably for the best, because if it did ritual summoning, it'd probably be number 1. DDDs are heavily complicated. There's so many cards that activate in the graveyard, the banish zone, the pendulum scales when they're special summoned, effects that burn you, you keep track of life points. There's so many things to balance when it comes to DDDs, it's ridiculous. Not to mention, there's so many like combos. People will put their hearts and soul into this deck. There's so many different versions of it. You can play so many different like little tweaks to it, like little tech cards in DDDs. And the whole deck just functions phenomenally. It's probably one of the coolest pendulum decks of all time, and probably the most complicated pendulum deck of all time. So that's why I have it here at number 4. Now you're probably thinking, how the hell is it number 4? Well, personally, my opinion, there is 3 decks more complicated than DDD, which I know how, but I have them, and here they are. So it's time to go into this. Alright, so for number 3, we have Infernity. And you're probably wondering, why the hell is Infernity more complicated than DDD? Well, in my opinion, this deck does just a little bit more than DDD when it comes to its complications. Because unlike DDD that summons every mechanic, Infernity summons a shit ton of mechanics, but also has restrictions, and also is just overall just a resource infinite loop deck. So if you don't know Infernity, this is probably one of our first infinite loop decks. The whole point of Infernity is that you want to loop the non-once return effect of Infernity Archer here. Well, and Archfiend, my apologies, not Archer. But this guy is an infinite loop because he adds resources every turn. But here's the issue. Unlike most infinite loops, and unlike, for example, Ritual Beast, you must require no cards in hand in order to do so. So not only are you have to add resources to hand, you have to then summon those resources, and you must do this infinitely with no cards in hand. This deck uses graveyard effects, banishing effects. Well, not really banishing effects, but there is banishing in the deck. There's a whole bunch of adding in this deck. There's a whole bunch of just managing what you make and how you make it. This deck is just stupidly complicated. And the reason why I think it's more complicated than DDD is just because not only you had to do it with no hand, but you also had to do it an infinite number of times. And if your loop is stopped, you have to figure a way to recreate the loop, or you're just passing turn. And if you're passing turn, you're losing the duel. Because this deck, when it has probably one of the highest ceilings in the game, no joke. When an Infernity player goes off, they're ending on like 4 Omni Negates, Abyss Dweller, Appaloosa for 4. It's like ridiculous how stupid this deck can loop. But the issue is that, one, Infernity is bad. A lot of their cards need modern support, which they are getting. They have gotten some modern support, so the deck is getting better. But it's just for the simple fact that the mechanic requires you having no cards in hand and then doing an infinite loop. It's a very, very, very hard deck to play. Not just for its complexity, but also the flaws in the deck itself. So that's why I have it for number 3. And now it's time to talk about number 2, Six Samurai. Six Samurai, holy shit. Another looping deck, another combo deck. Probably makes as many cards, like almost as many cards as, honestly, DDDs do, except Pendulum. Does everything that DDDs do, except Pendulums. But they also have an infinite loop, and they also have the resource counters. So if you don't know Six Samurai, they're a warrior spam archetype that revolve around special summoning a whole bunch of Six Samurai and adding a whole bunch of Six Samurai from your deck by balancing Gateway of the Six. Gateway is an infinite loop card That's a non-one's return, add a 6 Samurai hand. And all the 6 Samurai say, if you control 6 Samurai, special summon them, which adds cards onto Gateway. And this deck can get out of hand very, very quickly. The Infinite Resource Loop, this deck on its own with Shogun and everyone can probably last like a 20-minute turn if there's no interruptions. And don't even get me started when there are interruptions, because not only is this deck looping you for looping the same cards for like 20 turns, but they're building like a god board afterwards. Now, the reason why 6 Samurai isn't a meta deck is because, one, they cannot play going second. If you make a board against a 6 Samurai player, or you play a Floodgate against a 6 Samurai player, they lose. They fumble. Another reason why 6 Samurai is not number one is that, well, they're complicated in the fact they're doing a whole huge resource loop, but at the same time, that resource loop is just summoning the same cards over and over again and just getting the loop started and maintaining the loop. That's the most complicated part about 6 Samurai. So that's why I have it at number 2. But there is still one more deck, even more complicated than 6 Samurai, and that deck being Flower Guardians. Flower Guardians, give it a hand. You are the most complicated deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because honestly, you're not a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. In my personal opinion, Flower Guardians is basically just a whole different card game. Now, the argument can also be for Valiance, because that's technically a whole other card game too. But personally, I don't think Valiance is that complicated. It's just special something different than Roll Pendulums. Flower Guardians, on the other hand, Flower Guardians are literally a whole other card game. One, they're warrior monsters that all have the effect to summon themselves multiple times a turn and basically draw cards. That's the whole mechanic of this deck. Now, you are locked into Flower Guardians, which suck, and it's a Synchro archetype, but the whole deck is like based on Hanafulu cards, and all the monsters have different effects, and it's very luck-based, because you gotta draw your cards in the right hand, and you gotta stack your cards in the right order, and there's a lot of knowledge required for Flower Guardians. And that's why I feel like it's not even playing Yu-Gi-Oh! The deck ends on like really, really powerful synchros, but the deck just isn't playing Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just like playing its own card game. And that's why I have to put Flower Guardians at number 1. You probably don't even know this deck, most people watching this channel, because you never face a Flower Guardian player, because they don't really exist. I probably met one in my entire 5 years of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'm number 2. There's not that many of us. Flower Guardians are just ultra, super complicated for no reason. Now, don't get me wrong, they don't have the spreadsheets, but the reason why they're so complicated is that they just are very, very luck-based. And not like the way like milling cards at tier elements is luck-based. They're luck-based on what you draw, how you excavate cards, how you put cards back, how you summon cards, where you summon those cards. It's really, really complicated. Trust me, read these cards and learn this deck and come back to me in the comments, and you don't think Flower Guardians doesn't deserve the top spot. Because holy shit, I own this deck for probably about 6-7 months now, and I'm still like an amateur at this deck. Like, I'm still learning these cards. I'm like, this shit's just tough. I don't know, maybe I didn't put enough heart and soul into playing Flower Guardians. I'm still reading the cards, but I don't know. To me, most complicated deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has to go to them. Flower Guardians deserve number 1 spot. Most complicated deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's about it. I hope you all enjoy. Take care. Don't do anything stupid. And I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.